welcome back to my channel. If you're new here, I'm Holly and this is my booktube channel. I talk all things reading, all things books, and sometimes coffee. And today, I don't have a new coffee to share. I'm still drinking that Mods number 6, but I did bring the little K-Cup pod with me so you can see the branding. Can y'all see that? I hope you can. That's it. That's the one I'm drinking. But I didn't want to leave you totally empty-handed as far as coffee, so I was trying to think, what are some good coffees for January? And I thought of two. One is by a coffee company called Bones Coffee Company, B-O-N-E-S, Bones. And I'll probably get a picture and put it up here on the screen so you can see it. And they have a ton of different flavors, but the French vanilla one is really good. I feel like in January, I'm just good with like fresh start, clean slate, no crazy flavors, just the basics. That's my January vibe. And another one that I thought y'all might enjoy is by a brand called Kicking Horse Coffee. I found out about them because I was interested in finding coffees that test for mold, yeast, and bacteria. Because there's a lot of that in our coffee beans and we're ingesting it and it's not good for our health. So Kicking Horse does a really good job of constantly testing for mold, yeast, bacteria with an independent laboratory, and almost 100% of the time their coffee is found to be free of all those sorts of toxins. And one of my favorite coffees of theirs is called Smartass. I love the names, I love the coffee, and yeah, y'all should go check those two out. So for today's video, by the time you're seeing this, when this video goes live, it should be Martin Luther King Jr. Day. So I thought it would just be a perfect day to talk about books centered around Martin Luther King Day, specifically books that have elements of justice and injustice, and kind of discuss some of the racial injustices throughout history and things like that. I know not everyone is into that sort of thing, but I just feel like it'd be an insult to his memory if we didn't at least talk about it a little bit. I promise I'm not gonna get political. I don't go there, I don't do that. This is just books that I have found really interesting, and even some books that I have not read yet, but I want to. So, with that, let's get into the video. This probably goes without saying, but Martin Luther King Jr. was one of the most prominent leaders of the civil rights movement from about 1955 until his assassination in 1968. He obviously was famous for his "I Have a Dream" speech, and I have some favorite quotes of his that I wanted to read y'all that I think sort of ties in and helps explain the theme of the books I'm going for here. So I'm gonna look down at my phone and read it. The first is, "I have a dream that even in the state of Mississippi, a state sweltering with the heat of injustice, sweltering with the heat of oppression, will be transformed into an oasis of freedom and justice." That touches on those themes that I was talking about of injustice and justice and all the things he was fighting for at the time, and that in many ways we're still fighting today. So I really like that quote. The second quote I love is one you've probably heard, and it is, "I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal," which is of course from the United States Declaration of Independence. So with those two quotes in mind and Martin Luther King Jr. in mind, I wanted to share some books that I felt were relevant to this day and are just good to read in general. So let's jump into it. We're gonna start out with books that I've already read and then get into some books that I haven't read yet but really want to. And the first book I have for you is called Just Mercy by Bryan Stevenson. Bryan Stevenson is an attorney, he's African American, and he is a social activist, an attorney, a law professor, and this book gets into one of the first cases he ever had. It was him defending a man named Walter McMillan, I believe, and he was wrongly convicted of a murder that he didn't commit, and he was sitting on death row for it. And Bryan, this baby attorney fresh out of law school, is tasked with defending him. And being an attorney myself, I'd be freaking terrified of that assignment. I don't know how he did it. And he writes all about it in this book and talks about a lot of how broken our justice system is, and just all the issues related to that. But it doesn't read like nonfiction. It's actually extremely entertaining and just so heart-wrenching. And if you haven't read it, you really need to. That is Just Mercy by Bryan Stevenson. Oh, and he actually founded the Equal Justice Initiative. They are an organization that fights for people who are impoverished or wrongly convicted, things along those lines. So it's a really fantastic organization, and that organization is his brainchild. So again, Just Mercy by Bryan Stevenson. The next book I have for you came out not too long ago, I think, is The Color of Compromise by Jamar Tisby. Hope I'm pronouncing that right. This gets into a lot of the history surrounding racial injustices in the American church. I didn't know what to expect going into this, but I learned so much. If you go into this book with an open mind and willing to learn, it really opens your eyes to a lot of the historical issues and oppressions that were, stemming from the American church just kind of as a whole. He gets into some really hard topics about how, so-called people of faith worked hard to keep a lot of the racial divides in place and used, Christianity as a way to try to justify those divides, which as a Christian myself, it's hard to hear, but that doesn't make it untrue. So this is a really awesome book, and I highly recommend it. That is The Color of Compromise by Jamar Tisby. The third book I have for you has been out a long time and is quite famous, and that is To Kill a Mockingbird by Harper Lee. Gosh, this has been out forever. I believe it's been out since 1960, and it won a Pulitzer Prize like a year after it came out, so 1961. This is a coming-of-age story told from the perspective of Scout, and it follows her and her dad, Atticus Finch. Her dad, Atticus, is an attorney, and he is assigned to defend an African-American man who has been accused of attacking and raping a white woman. And really the story is about Scout and a child's awakening to racism in the world. She kind of sees her dad going through defending this man and just the town's negative response to that. Back at the time, it just wasn't done. I mean, now it didn't take place in 1960. It was well before that, I believe, the setting of the book. It's been so long since I've read it, but yeah, it goes through his defense of this man and just, again, the racial injustices that we were seeing in history at that time. And it's famous, it's a movie, it's a great book. So if you haven't already read this, you probably did in school. They probably made you read it at some point. But if you haven't, it's great. That is To Kill a Mockingbird by Harper Lee. The next book I have to recommend is a little different, and that is The Green Mile by Stephen King. This was also one of the first Stephen King books I ever read as maybe a teenager, I think, and I think it really fits into this video. You are basically back in, I believe, like the 1930s time period, and it's all taking place at this maximum security prison, specifically cell block E, where they keep death row inmates. The main prisoner that the book focuses on is a prisoner named John Coffey. He's an African-American man, and he is extremely large, and that is relevant. I won't say why, because it's kind of a spoiler, but he's a huge man, like extremely tall, extremely strong, just a really big man. I believe in the movie he was played by Michael Clark Duncan, and if you know him, that's how big this man is. I mean, just a big guy. And again, it's relevant to the story, but I won't say why. In the book, John Coffey was convicted of a really horrible crime. I won't go into what exactly because it's kind of graphic, but if you've read it or seen the movie, you know. And it talks about all the things that happen in cell block E. I feel like I can't say without spoiling it, but eventually you learn the truth about what really happened that day that this awful thing happened and John Coffey was accused of it. And you know, this is the 1930s. Being African American in the 1930s, you did not get a whole lot of respect, you didn't get a whole lot of say, you didn't get much defense. And it really touches on those themes, and it's a hell of an entertaining story at the same time. So if you haven't checked out the book or the movie stars Tom Hanks. So you gotta love Tom Hanks. Definitely check it out. That is The Green Mile by Stephen King. These next few books are ones that I have not read, but they are on my Amazon wish list. And I've got some notes on my phone so that I can describe them to you accurately since I haven't read them yet. And I'll put a photo of the covers on the screen here next to me so you can see what they look like. The first book is called Just Pursuit, A Black Prosecutor's Fight for Fairness by Laura Coates. Essentially, like the title says, Laura Coates is a black prosecutor, and in her time as a prosecutor, she talks about how black communities are policed differently, how black defendants are prosecuted differently, and just all the differences racially within our justice system, which is kind of the theme we've been sort of talking about here. She gives a lot of real life stories that expose the flaws in our legal system. And as an attorney myself, I totally get it. And I'm anxious to read her perspective and educate myself further on the issues. So that is Just Pursuit by Laura Coates. The next book, I believe, has been out for a minute. It's called The New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander. Jim Crow refers to the Jim Crow laws that were in place to legalize racial segregation at the time. And I believe the name Jim Crow comes from a minstrel show at the time called Jump Jim Crow. And essentially Jim Crow was an African American character that was depicted to be this bumbling buffoon and had broken English and just basically was supposed to embody every racial stereotype. And why that was entertaining for people, I'll never understand, but that's where the name comes from. And thankfully, Jim Crow laws are, of course, abolished today. However, even though they've been abolished, this book gets into how there are still injustices in our legal system, still plenty of flaws, still things that we are working to smooth out as attorneys and judges and justices and people that create this legal system. We realize it's flawed and we're working on it. I don't know if y'all can tell, but the lighting may have changed and I have a new mug. My camera battery died and I just learned my first booktuber lesson. Always have 2 batteries charged at all times, which I didn't. So, had to put it on the charger, wait for it to charge, and while I was doing that, I set my coffee down and Chief drank it. He's either gonna be really sick or really hyper. I don't know which is worse, but new mug, new battery, let's rock and roll. I believe when we left off, I was talking about the book, The New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander, and I think I discussed everything I really needed to discuss. Essentially, it just touches on the problem of mass incarceration and the role that race plays in all of that, because I believe it's like 56% of all wrongful convictions are African American. I'm not educated enough yet to understand all that goes into that, but that's why I read these books, so I can try to understand, try to educate myself, try to grow as a person. So that is The New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander. So this next book sounds really interesting. It is called Redeeming Justice by Jarrett Adams. Jarrett Adams himself was wrongfully convicted of a crime when he was just 17 years old, and he was facing 30 years in prison. He contacted the Wisconsin Innocence Project, who came and defended him and was able to exonerate him. And once he got out, he went to law school and became an attorney, and now he defends people that were in situations just like he was, wrongfully convicted of a crime with little to no resources to put up a good defense in court. He was eventually hired by the New York Innocence Project, and his first case was defending someone in the same court that had convicted him a decade earlier. So I'm so anxious to read his story, and I mean, it just sounds incredible to go from convicted defendant at 17 to total badass attorney defending people in the same court that wrongfully convicted you a decade earlier. That is just so cool. So that is Redeeming Justice. The last book I have to share with you is called The Devil in the Grove by Gilbert King. This is the story of Thurgood Marshall around the time when he was about to bring the landmark case Brown versus Board of Education to the United States Supreme Court. Thurgood Marshall, if you don't know who that is, he was a civil rights lawyer and activist, and he was actually eventually the first African-American Supreme Court justice ever. So while he was working on the Brown versus Board of Education case, this was in about 1949, he became involved in another case, and the people involved in that are now kind of famously known as the Groveland Boys. The Groveland Boys were 4 young black men who were accused of raping a white girl. And of course, this is 1949, so racial issues are hot, and eventually the Ku Klux Klan gets involved, and they are wreaking havoc and making their lives a living hell, and it's dangerous and scary and life-threatening. And the associate attorney that was actually working with Thurgood Marshall on the Groveland Boys case, he was murdered. So Thurgood Marshall himself was getting death threats, all kinds of issues, and people said it was a suicide mission for him to work on this case, but he was a badass and he said, I don't care, it's important and I'm doing it. So basically the book just talks about his story, and it gets into some of the FBI's files that were formerly classified, and even some of the NAACP files surrounding the case, and it sounds juicy and incredible, and I cannot wait to read The Devil in the Grove by Gilbert King. Well, that wraps up my book recommendations and books I want to read on Martin Luther King Jr. Day. I hope you all have a fantastic day and take some time to read about relevant issues. And before I leave, I wanted to leave y'all with a little bit of information. You may have sensed a central theme with all of these books. There was a lot of topics centered around people who are wrongfully convicted, people who don't get a great defense because they can't afford the highest fancy attorneys. There are organizations out there who are completely dedicated and devoted to defending people in those types of situations. And if you all have ever seen the Netflix show, The Innocence Project, it's based on, well, actually, I think it's called The Innocence Files, and it's based on the Innocence Project, which has branches all over the United States, and you can contact them if you know of someone that needs this kind of assistance or you yourself need this assistance. And I'm just going to list the ones I know of that are here in the state of Texas where I live. So if you're in Texas, you can feel free to contact those organizations. So the 3 I have for you are the Thurgood Marshall School of Law Innocence Project. That's in the Houston, Texas area. I have the Actual Innocence Clinic, that is in the Austin, Texas area. And the Innocence Project of Texas, which is in the Fort Worth, Texas area. So you've got kind of northern Texas, central Texas, and east Texas. Those are the ones I know of. There could be more in Texas, but hopefully if you need one here in this state, you can find one near you, or check out the Innocence Project website. You can locate pretty much any of them all across the United States. And I'm sorry if this was a heavier topic for today. I know typically BookTube, we like to keep it light, keep it fun, but I did warn y'all that being an attorney, that part of me would leak out every now and then. But hopefully this video was still fun for y'all and still interesting and informative. And I hope y'all found something that you'd like to read, or maybe you've already read books like this. And if you have, I'd love to hear your recommendations. Leave them in a comment below. And I will see y'all in my next video. Bye y'all.